My name is Vikram Mansharamani, and I'm running for U.S. Senate.
Okay. So I'm going to jump in. So United States Senate, it is a pretty high office. It seems like a kind of a high post to be aiming for with no previous political experience. Why should voters vote for somebody who has no firsthand knowledge of how government works?
Yes, so I think that's, the question is phrased with an operating assumption that the skills one acquires at a local level are useful at a national level. And let me answer the question perhaps differently, which is, why am I suited for the position as a U.S. Senator? And I think if we distinguish between all the candidates and my experience, where I would start with is I have spent my entire career looking at national economic level issues and topics. I've worked with Fortune 500 companies on navigating geopolitical uncertainty, economic uncertainty, regulatory uncertainty, and thinking about how macroeconomic policies can impact inflation, prices, labor markets, and the cost of money. And so those are the issues and those are the topics that matter to the U.S. Senate. And so if we think about that, the sort of level of analysis, the level of focus, the sort of domain of expertise and experience I have lines up at that level, meaning, frankly, I don't know any state that has elected officials at the state level or within the state that care about foreign affairs, that pay attention to geopolitical matters, that pay attention to monetary policy, that pay attention to the U.S. government's relationships with other countries for trade, for cyber relationships, intelligence gathering, military relationships, political relationships, supply chain relationships, commodity relationships, or what have you. Those are just not states' issues. Those are national issues. And so the question, I think, is better phrased, which is what makes you suited to be a national level, political leader. And I think it has to do with that, the level of analysis. Further, the domain. So not only the level of analysis, which is national or global, but also the topics of interest to me that I've spent 30 years paying attention to. We'll go back and start with the fact that, when Tiananmen Square happened, it really confused me. And as a teenager, I thought, this has got to be a really evil regime that attacks its own people. And so I was fascinated by China. I was an East Asian studies major as an undergraduate. I studied Chinese. I worked at the American Enterprise Institute in DC on their Asian studies desk with former US Ambassador to China, Jim Lilly. Then I went over and worked at the US Embassy in Beijing. And I've since, over the last 30 years, traveled all over China, done business in China, interacted with Chinese business leaders, academics, and journalists, etc. And I've kept tabs on China. I continue to have a global perspective on China. That's number one. Number two, I've got a master's degree in international security studies. And I've spent a lot of time looking at the geopolitics of various security relationships, as well as how economics interacts with those security relationships and how economic might at home and an economic superpower translates that into geopolitical influence. And so I've potentially, I've been definitely aware and watching how that relationship in China has taken place, the economic might turning into military and other might. I think there's a very strong relationship between those two. And so between my business career, which is focused on global industries, global issues, a little bit of my academic work, I didn't tell you about that, but I've always given back. I've spent the last 13 years teaching a class to try to help future generations of business leaders think differently about the future. I've taught classes on finance, economics, business ethics, governance, and then also most recently, global affairs. And so these are the issues that I think apply to the US Senate. That's the level of analysis where it happens. Those are the topics of interest, and they align with my experience and interests.
Okay, so on your website, you highlight a quote saying the politicians spend too much time talking to each other and listening to so-called experts. You're an author and a lecturer. Aren't you one of those so-called experts?
It's very interesting that you ask that way, Bill. If you notice behind me, and again, I don't know whether if you're going to post this as a recording, then hopefully it's the video as well. So the listeners and those watching.
Absolutely.
Good. So you'll see there's a picture I keep behind my desk here. It's a fox. It's something that I have branded all my corporate work with, and it's become a sort of symbol of how I think of myself. And now, what is it about the fox? If you go back to ancient Greek poetry, Archilochus, 2,500 or so years ago, noted that the hedgehog knows one big thing, but a fox knows many little things. So I've never thought of myself as an expert. I think of myself as a global generalist. I've studied liberal arts. I was a multidisciplinary major, East Asian studies as an undergrad. In my PhDs in the field of innovation. What is innovation? Is it economics? Yes. Is it psychology? Yes. Is it politics? Yes. Is it strategy? Yes. Is it finance? Yes. It's all of the above. I've always thought of myself as broad rather than deep. And as a result, even my most recent book called Think for Yourself talks about, restoring common sense and keeping experts in their domain of expertise. That in fact, a generalist, someone who looks broadly, widely, is more open-minded by definition, because when they enter a room, for instance, I know that there are people who know more about virtually every topic that I know about. I know a little bit about a lot. I don't know a lot about a little. And that's a difference of philosophy and approach. Unfortunately, in today's society, people tend to equate those who have written or those who have taught with very narrow siloed expertise. I explicitly reject those characterizations, Bill, and I think of myself as a global generalist who looks wide, not deep. I think experts should be kept on tap, not on top. And I think every perspective, every expert, their perspective is limited, biased, and incomplete. And as such, we need to have multiple forms of expertise, multiple inputs in order for us to form any sort of logical path forward. And so, I would think I'm one of those inputs that someone should consider if they're thinking about the topics that I happen to write about, speak about, advise on, or consult about.
It's pretty unusual to hear candidates and particularly Republican candidates touting their globalist view of things.
Yes.
So are you finding as you go around the state that New Hampshire voters are looking for that?
It's interesting. It's a great question, Tom. I think there's a variety of views. There is no question that there is an element of the Republican Party that has turned very strongly towards an isolationist approach. They don't want to be funding Ukraine. They don't want to be worried about Taiwan. They don't want to be worried about what's happening in the Middle East or Latin America or Europe. And they want to focus the resources here in America on the individual needs of our country. And they'd like to deploy those resources. I am not of that mindset. Let me be crystal clear. I believe America has a leadership role in the world to play. I believe that we are an exceptional nation. And I'm never going to apologize for that. I think American leadership matters. I think it keeps the world safe. I believe that when America telegraphs strength, our enemies and those who might do harm to American interests abroad take notice. And when America telegraphs weakness, I believe our enemies and those who want to do harm to us take advantage. And so I believe that actually American values, protection of individual rights, respect for, et cetera, are good values. I really do. And I think in the world, we are a positive influence on the world, particularly, and I don't know if you want to go in this direction yet, particularly given what I think is the ascendancy of China and the threat that poses to the global world order of thinking about and respecting different ways to organize societies. I mean, I think it's always been thought of as a two or three system world, right? If you thought about it as, democratic capitalism on one side, and then the other side historically was thought of as authoritarian or socialist, or et cetera. You're starting to see some blending, and that blending of, well, Scandinavia's democratic socialist. Well, that's kind of a different model. China, is it really authoritarian capitalist? Like, is that possible? Like, not sure. Regardless, I think there's a whole bunch of challenges to the world that we have thought of as normal. And specifically, the rise of China presents a material challenge, and I would argue a threat to the American way of life in the long run.
So let's since that's where you've kind of gone off to, let's talk about that for a minute. So one aspect of that is China's obvious desire to expand its footprint and control in the Pacific, and so they're building, they're asserting that they, different areas of international waters are actually theirs, such and such. At what point should the U.S. step up and say that's far enough? And what do you do in response to that? What's the step that you take?
Yeah. Well, so let's go back and actually let me reflect a little bit on why I think China is such an evil regime and their manifestation of that dynamic right now. I think if we look at what's happening in Western China, the genocide, let's call it what it is. There is a genocide going on in Western China today. Their expansionism with the Belt and Road Project through Central Asia, down into Africa, up into the Middle East and into Europe, all through Southeast Asia as well. Their hijacking of global multilateral institutions. The UN Human Rights Council will never call what's happening in Western China a genocide, because China's cronies and those who are, indebted to China through the Belt and Road debt or some other ways are never going to vote that way. And China's been a member of many of these bodies that would be calling China to task. So I think we have really a gigantic and subversive threat. More specifically, as you're indicating, their expansionism in the east to the islands, whether that includes Taiwan or whether it's into the South China Sea, presents an encroaching expansionism that should concern all of us. Now, what do we do about it? I think we, with our allies and with our friends, telegraph very clearly that the expansionism will not be tolerated, and very clearly might include arming today as a deterrence. Like, I actually think deterrence is the right way to proceed here. You don't want to be in a war with China. We do not, that is not a good thing. So whether that's giving the giving the Taiwanese appropriate military equipment, missiles to, sort of defend themselves against amphibious attacks, or, what have you, I think we should do that. I think we should continue to have naval exercises where we demonstrate freedom of navigation on open seas. I don't think we should ever fire a shot first. I don't want to be starting a war. But at the same time, international waters, we have the right to traffic through them. Anyone should have the right to traffic through them. And so if we walk softly but carry a very big stick, I think we'll be able to demonstrate that actually this is something we plan to maintain. Now, we have to be prepared to push back should they encroach on that. And I think we should be. With that said, I really don't want to find ourselves in a military conflict with the Chinese. That's probably not a constructive dynamic for anyone on this planet.
Okay, and so another side of the potential threat from China is ongoing espionage regarding technology, weapon systems. What steps would you take to thwart those efforts, or even of other nations whose threats are not necessarily military?
Look, I would tell you, Bill, right off the bat, awareness is the first and foremost thing we need to do. And this was wonderful work that former Congressman Mike Rogers on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence did, which was educating the world that 5G telecom equipment from Huawei actually was producing vulnerabilities and backdoors for the Chinese to acquire the information that went over those networks. And so right off the bat, we need to be aware that all these risks exist. And I would argue very few people, as a percentage of those who should be aware, actually are aware. There's some obviously high-profile, documented intellectual property thefts, including of military equipment, et cetera. What one does about that going forward is absolutely investing in cybersecurity and making sure that that kind of theft doesn't happen. But it's a more, I would argue, pernicious and disturbing development, because it's utilizing some basic American philosophies against us. Take the education domain, for instance. Universities generally have this idea of open research and sharing what insights are found through basic research for the benefit of society. Well, I taught at Harvard for 5 years, no longer on the faculty there, but I believe it was 3 years ago, the head or the chair of the chemistry department at Harvard was removed in handcuffs for having accepted material sums of money from the Chinese government to assist on the development of labs, et cetera. And this was all done in an undisclosed way. And, there was some concern. We have lots of infiltration that I think has taken place already in legal mechanisms of those who are loyal to the Chinese. And the Confucius Institute, we can go on and on, but it's also in the actual systems and places that are managing them and monitoring them, the technology. It's a lot deeper than that. So I think step one is absolute awareness that this is happening. Step two is fortification of our defenses, and that might be cybersecurity technologies. That has to be sort of limited access. It might need to be, and I don't want to get too technical, but zero trust systems and sort of all these things to make sure that only those who should have access get access to certain information, because the intellectual property theft has been overwhelming. I'd go further, and I would say we actually need to disentangle our supply chains for those items that are critical to the functioning of our society from China. For instance, active pharmaceutical ingredients, vitamin C, acetaminophen, antibiotics. We get disproportionately large percentages, 70, 80, 90% of those items come and are sourced from China. That's a problem. I do not want a hostile foreign power able to turn off America's supply of acetaminophen. Likewise, I think we should also be wary of having dependence upon them for, you mentioned military equipment, information side of things, but what about the rare earth materials that go into some of the night vision goggles or the permanent magnets that are needed, or et cetera? China has a virtual monopoly on global processing of rare earth materials. That's a problem. We should be building that out here in the United States. And in fact, we are. Semiconductors, they're not very dominant. They're not dominant on a global scale, and definitely not at the high end of semiconductors. But if we think about China as potentially taking Taiwan, well, Taiwan has 92% of the high-end semiconductors that are produced on this planet. Those do power our defense electronics and other electronics. By the way, the other 8% happens to be geographically even closer to China, and that's on the Korean peninsula. Korea produces the remaining 8% of the highest end semiconductors. So I think we do need to disengage and sort of decouple from China on the most critical components that power our economy and our military. I don't think there's any role for Chinese vulnerabilities or dependencies in those sectors.
Okay, so in terms of, I have one more foreign policy kind of question, and then I want to just kind of circle back. So China is not the only potential global threat out there, and so in terms of foreign policy, we have trading partners and we have strategic military allies.
Yeah.
And much of Europe falls into both those categories. biggest threat there right now appears to be Russia. So what should the US be doing to keep Russia from annexing its neighbors, not just Ukraine, but other bordering nations that are similarly nervous?
Look, I think NATO is, in fact, that cooperative security framework is a useful one. Like many Republicans, I feel very strongly that the NATO members should pay their bill, right? I mean, I'm happy to be a participant in that as America, but I think that the others should be paying their fair share. But I think that's a cooperative security framework that makes a lot of sense, and could be used to contain Russia and prevent Russian expansionism. Now, we got to be firm and draw red lines, and they need to be crystal clear, and they need to be backed up with capability. And that, I think, in the case of Russian expansionism, needs to be made crystal clear, especially given the encroachment into Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine. So I think there's a framework in place there to manage that. I would be more concerned about Russian activity going in the Arctic towards Canada. I would be concerned about Russian activity, coming down towards the Middle East, as we've seen them meddle in Syria and elsewhere. So I think, the Russia going towards Europe thing, there is a framework in place to manage that. And if it's made firm and telegraph strength, I think we should be able to contain. Now, we're talking, Bill, in a very conventional sense, right, of war as military and might and people crossing borders. What happens if there's a cyber attack takes down the German grid, and it came from Russia? Is that an act of war? Are we now at war with Russia? What is that? What if it kills more people than a military maneuver might have? I think these lines are blurring. We have to get more clarity in how to think about cooperating on a lot of these issues, but the framework can and still should hold as a deterrence mechanism. So, but yeah, look, I think Russia, Iran, and China, you can think of as a new axis effectively. Or I do. I shouldn't say you can. I think I do. It's probably a better way to say it.
Okay. As I said, I want to circle back a little bit. Your tagline for your campaign is "a businessman, not a politician." You say we need a businessman to fix our economy, but government isn't a business. It's a very different type of entity. Why would it take a businessman to make a difference?
Well, let me give you a framework that I use that I think has proven constructive from business, and I think has broad applicability in many domains. And it's really a three-part logic, and logic's probably the right word, approach might be the right word, to addressing problems that seem intractable. And I think this framework and framing of a problem can help us develop some breakthroughs. So I begin with always transparency. We always, every business situation I come in, I need information, I need to gather it, I need to understand what's happening, I need full transparency and understand. Second, I need accountability. Okay, if this information says this is happening, who's the person? Where's the link to the actual individual human being who's doing that, that's accountable for this particular item that we're paying attention to? So transparency, what's happening, accountability, linkage to an individual and person and activity that we have to manage and monitor, and then competition, because competition is the exit option. In the event that this system isn't working, I need a new system to go pursue. Let's take that to education, something that's about as far as you can think also from the domain of business. Transparency. I believe every parent wants to know what their kids are being taught. I really do. I think they want to know what's been, it's not trying to manage what's being taught, it's wanting to know what's being taught. That's transparency. Secondly, accountability. Okay, you said you're going to teach this utilizing these materials. Did you teach that in that way with those materials? Who is the person we're checking? That's a teacher, that's someone, there's an aide, there's a classroom, there's a grouping of teachers. There's some accountability of individual responsibility for the actions that were transparently described as what would be happening. Lastly, competition. In the event that the school is teaching something that I'm okay with in a way I don't like, I want an option to go elsewhere. In the event they're teaching something I really don't agree with, but doing it very well, I also want the option. But competition and choice, in the language of education, you might use the word choice instead of competition, but competition tends to work. let's do that. Let's switch gears for a second in healthcare, another intractable problem that government seems to struggle with from a financial and economic perspective. My wife, actually, this is a great example. Here, we'll just use a real-time example. My wife tore her ACL. So she tore her ACL in March of this year up at Loon Mountain. And, you know, she had to get an MRI. She had to go and get the surgery. They took a little bit from her hamstring and reattached the ACL, and she's been therapy, etc. And we're going to make this interactive. I can't help myself. I did teach for a living for some time, but, you know, do you guys have any sense as to how much that cost?
What the insurance coverage is.
No, Tom, do you have any sense?
Cost you or
The cost
was billed to someone?
The cost, the total cost. Yeah, to someone plus me. Any sense?
I would say maybe in the 20,000s.
Okay. Tom, any idea?
I was going to be less than that. Still significant.
Yeah. You know what the answer is? I don't know. I actually don't know. There's no transparency. We made decisions without any insight into how it's going to work. And, you know, the estimates that I often hear are as high as $50,000 to $70,000. She's in a hospital. She's in an emergency, or not an emergency, she's in an operating room. She has a whole day there. She has recovery. She's had PT for weeks on end. She had MRIs on the front end. You know, we just have no clarity. There's no transparency. Not only that, there's no accountability in terms of trying to manage those costs or keep them controlled and contained. And then there's very little competition because of the insurance system lacks the sort of options and choice, et cetera. Particularly here in New Hampshire, we don't, you know, post Governor Shaheen's consolidation of healthcare, we haven't really had as many options. So let me contrast that with something else. So I talked about my wife tearing her ACL, but what if you went and you wanted to get surgery on your eyes, the Lasik eye surgery? I actually still wear contact lenses. I see you guys wear glasses. But what if we wanted to go get Lasik eye surgery? Well, over the last 20 years, because there's no government involvement here, there is complete transparency. People tell you what the rate, the consumer information is overflowing. Companies are competing based on it. The technology is getting better. People don't overbuy technology because they can bill it through to an insurance. You know, there is a market, private sector approach to handling this. At the cost, excuse me, the cost of getting LASIK eye surgery has fallen by 40%. Outcomes have improved dramatically. And that is a direct result of transparency, accountability, and competition. That's the kind of business logic I think we need to take to a lot of these issues, which is, what are we trying to do? Who's trying to do it? And is there a better way to do it? So yes, government is not a business. I agree with that statement. Excuse me. But it's not to say that a business logic, businessmen care less about issues other than getting things done. We care about solutions. We're not motivated. I'm not motivated in going down there to get some fancy title. I want to do stuff. I want to get stuff done. And then, by the way, I'm happy I've signed a term limits pledge. I'm happy to come back and let someone else keep going. Because if you can't make change, why are you spending your time down there? There's too much of this career politician stuff that's going on. People getting their talents stuck in this system and living off of it. That was never the intent. It should not be the intent. And I think people that are career political types that want to go down there, stay there forever and make a ton of money off the endeavor are not great for this country. That's where we are. That's where we've gotten, right? We need to get rid of the career politicians.
Okay, so
supposed to have been a tour of duty. And I think the businessman logic lends itself to that thinking.
So you want to go down and you want to do something. You want to accomplish something.
Yes.
You just talked about the lack of transparency in healthcare billing.
Yeah, just as an example, sure.
And such. So what are you going to go down and propose? What bill are you going to put forth that deals with healthcare?
Yeah, so healthcare is on the list, but if you want to talk specifics, let me tell you something that I think would impact Granite State families immediately. That is an issue that, again, similar approach logic would take and be very helpful. We should restore U.S. energy independence. period. End of story, right? So what do you do there? Yes, you get the Keystone XL pipeline, get that restarted. What else can you do? You can absolutely provide full transparency on the permitting process for federal lands, for people to land, for drilling and all that good stuff. We should have an all of the above energy policy. We should allow anyone and everyone. And what does that mean from a bill perspective? You can say, look, we're not going to beat up carbon. We're not. Actually, beating up carbon makes no sense for the environment, actually. Actually, focusing on things like subsidizing electric vehicles, not helpful. And the reason I say that is electric vehicles don't produce energy. So they're handouts. Yes, you can argue that in time, if we have alternative energies, they are going to produce something productive. But I would go so far as to say today, that is a misguided policy. We are paying for storage devices. And if you really, depending upon where you live in the state or the country, I could argue that electric vehicles are coal-fired vehicles, that they in fact are powered by coal energy. And so that is not necessarily better, particularly if you factor in the footprint, the carbon footprint utilized to produce an electric vehicle, as well as the carbon footprint to recycle an electric vehicle. Anyway, here's a tangible example of something we can go down and in a bill and start right away restoring U.S. energy independence, undo some of the executive actions, maybe even implement some laws to state this is U.S. policy. We're going to do. By the way, I would argue it's even good for national security reasons. Not being dependent upon countries that hate us is a constructive, positive thing to be. We should not be dependent on countries that hate us for oil, for semiconductors, for any form of energy, natural. In fact, we were in a position of strength where we were able to export oil and gas to our friends and our allies. So I think energy policy is one where we can very quickly take this similar transparency logic and say, look, I want to see transparently. I want full transparency. When you give a subsidy to an electric vehicle, are you helping the environment or not? And the answer is no. I mean, I've done the analysis in 6 ways to Sunday. I will tell you that it is not helping the environment to generically give money to subsidize electric vehicles. And yet this is some of the climate religion, I think, that exists, and alarmism that exists. So anyway, I realize I switched gears on you there, but with a direct thing. But I think the reason I think that's so impactful, and it would be a top priority of me to show up in DC and hit right away energy, is because energy also drives inflation, right? The diesel prices are, so I have my CDL license. I can drive a tractor trailer. I'm on the board of a trucking company. Diesel prices impact freight rates. Freight rates impact everything that's moved by a truck. Okay, so there's inflationary pressure on this bottle of Diet Coke. Why is that? Yes, it's made out of, if you really want to be technical, hydrocarbons utilized to make the plastics. Okay, fine, all that stuff. But there's also the pressure of fuel prices and the freight to bring it here from wherever it was made. And that's another form of inflationary pressure. So not only have we destabilized the world by becoming dependent on other countries for energy, we've also, I would argue, not helped the environment. There's no helping the environment by letting other people produce oil and gas rather than allowing our country to produce oil and gas. In fact, I would argue it's a negative impact, right? Because we have environmental regulations on oil and gas. We capture the methane. We don't dump the drilling fluids in the water. I don't know what they do in Kazakhstan or Indonesia or elsewhere where the oil would be potentially produced, but it's not what we do. And so if you want to save the environment, pump as much oil and gas as you can here in the United States, because we do it better than other places that pump oil and gas. And that's the way we need to think about it. Same thing with the reason I'm all of the above energy. If it makes economic sense, we should do it. The Chinese and the Indians are producing coal-fired power plants at the combined rate of 3 a week. There'll be 150 new coal-fired power plants. Why is that? Because they want reliable energy to power their economy. And then when they're wealthier, they'll have the ability to adapt. What have we chosen to do? We've chosen to take, instead of certain benefits of cheap, reliable energy, we've instead gone with uncertain benefits of environmental support or environmental protectionism and certain costs of higher energy prices. Whereas the Chinese and Indians are doing the opposite. Certain benefits of reliable energy, uncertain environmental costs. And if you really want to go further, I would tell you, if you power your economy, you will have the resources to invest in research and development to generate the next technologies and the next energy sources. And that is how we're going to get ourselves beyond fossil fuels, not by suggesting we're going to have, coal-fired electric, quote unquote, electric vehicles.
Okay, so you raised the topic of inflation,
Yeah,
which I
well,
know
right.
is yeah. You raised a lot of topics, but
Sorry,
inflation
right.
was one of them, and that is one of your main issues.
Yep.
So aside from energy, which you just went into at considerable length, what specific steps would you, as one senator among 100, take to reduce prices?
Well, so right off the bat, I think the energy policy is a major way to reduce prices. So let's get energy policy right. Inflation will come down. Secondly, we have to stop the spendathon, right? I mean, it's stupefying to me how frequently we see Washington just choose to spend beyond the means of what we have available. We should have a rule, something I'm happy to propose. If you want new spending, show me new cuts. Make a self-funded plan on every bill that you bring forward, right? Because otherwise we're adding to the debt. We're at 30 trillion and going up. And that 30 trillion is what we're leaving to our kids. Like, that's not fair. We mortgaged our future. We mortgaged our grandkids' futures. Now, you can grow the economy rapidly such that it becomes less burdensome and it's smaller as a percentage, but there's still a lot of money that needs to get paid back. And we need to teach responsibility. This giving away student loans or writing them off, or I forget, forgiving, whatever the language that has been used to describe this student loan write-off is wrong. It's wrong for this reason. It's not giving it away. It's not forgiving it. What's happening is it's being distributed to me, to you, to all of us. We're all going to pay for it. It's going to be tacked on the debt. And by the way, that's inflationary. That is inflation. It's spending and stimulus of a different form, right? So we are absolutely doing the wrong thing by spending more in a time of inflation. So what would I do for inflation? There's a handful of things that I would suggest that we can focus on. The first thing by far, control government spending. We borrowed too much, spent too much, printed too much. There's a whole list of things I would tell you we've done too much of, and we got to just stop it. And that's the problem. It almost feels like a ratchet. I don't know what the right language is. It's a ratchet where you can spend, but you never go down, ever. In fact, the numbers get bigger and bigger. I remember in college, they were like, oh, we're going to send $5 billion to some country for some, whoa, that's a lot of money. Now we're sending $40 billion over to Ukraine. And again, I'm okay with supporting the Ukrainians, but $40 billion is something like 6 or 7 times the amount of aid that we've provided to Israel, a democratic ally in the region. It's, I think, more than the entire State Department budget globally. So there's a scale problem. We just ratchet. Another thing we can do, which I've already touched on with China, you'll see that my ideas are all interrelated here. China, by disengaging the supply chains for critical ingredients and bringing them back home, that's going to reduce inflation. Right now, we have inflationary pressure on used car prices, used truck prices, new truck prices because of a lack of high-end chips that are utilized to finish those. There's other bottlenecks, et cetera. Once we get our own production, that will produce the supply response can come forth if we don't have bottlenecks in the supply chain. So that could reduce. And lastly, I'm a believer, and I'm sure we'll get there, but I apologize, Bill, for leading the conversation into different directions, but I think they're all interrelated, which is why I do it. Look, we can and should have a legal immigration system that allows those individuals who want to come here, who are willing to play by the rules, who are seeking a better life, who are not seeking handouts, who are coming because America is that shining city on a hill, who are coming here to seek that equality of opportunity, that are not worried that their father was a manual laborer. They want to come and be judged by what they themselves are able to provide and do and achieve. That's my personal story. My dad was an auto mechanic. He came here. right? And he came here because America was this. We need to enable legal immigration. And the reason I bring that up here is, yes, we can connect it to the southern border, and I have phrases I use such as tall wall, wide gate, but it also, I think, has the ability to impact some of our inflationary pressures. Right now, you can talk about that semiconductor bill that went around. I think they called it I forget what they called it, CHIPS Act or something like that, where they're giving a lot of money to the chips companies. I've talked to all the chips companies, most of them at least. They will tell you money is not the bottleneck to producing a semiconductor fabrication facility in the United States. Money is not the bottleneck. So we're giving them money, and they're very wealthy and they're worth a lot, these companies, and we're giving them money, but it's not their problem. Their problem, and what I think we would have bigger impact on the chip industry, is they don't have the skilled talent. The PhDs in these specialized fields, STEM fields that they need to hire are being produced here, but are being sent home because we don't have the immigration policy right. Well, we should enable inbound immigration that supports that industry. I'm not a believer that it should be only that type of immigration, which is only skilled. I think we should have anyone who wants to come and play by the rules come, because I can't pick the winners. And I can tell you the system produces people in the country after they've been here. The kids of immigrants who've come here take advantage of opportunities. I've seen it all over the country. And I think that's a really big opportunity to help inflation. So stop the spending, energy independence, supply chain disconnects from China and other countries that don't like us, and then, reforming legal immigration to enable some of the labor shortages to be addressed at the same time as, revitalizing and refreshing American entrepreneurial spirits.
Okay, so let's start with that last part. There are millions of what would be termed illegal immigrants here in our country who are here through no illegal actions of their own, and are hardworking contributors to our economy and our society,
Yep.
and are kind of just stuck in limbo. So explain a DACA solution that you would support.
Yeah. So this is a really complicated issue, and it's multi-layered, and unfortunately nuance is not something that works in politics. I'm learning. You were asking me earlier, Tom, about lessons learned from politics and my entree into politics, and I'm learning that while actually journalists are a lot better and they're willing to listen for a little bit longer, most voters are not. We have a multi-pronged problem with illegal migration, illegals in this country. Number one, we have to stop the flow that's growing the number internally. So a lot of people will agree with that. And that means whether that's build a tall wall and have a gate, so be it. We have to secure that southern border. We have to control the flow. I think your question is about the stock of existing individuals who are in this country and lack appropriate status. I think we have to balance, and I don't have an answer for you here today. We have to balance the compassion of individuals who have come and contributed, et cetera, with the disciplinary nature of having a society that lives by rules, and acknowledge that some of these individuals have broken rules. And we can't reward that. We have to get the incentive structures correct. It shouldn't be what it is now, easier to get in illegally. It shouldn't be that you can get a tourist visa, come into the United States, and then you just stay forever. It shouldn't be that you can do things illegally quicker and with less heartache than legally. We should get through this backlog that we have currently on all the processing of individuals who are here in these sort of hybrid statuses, et cetera. We should enable more. I think we need to get rid of the quota system that we have is not working. Whether we get rid of it or reform it in a different way, that is important to do. Seasonal workers up here in New Hampshire, we feel it all the time. I mean, Lincoln, it's seasonal work is actually pretty important because we're a seasonal economy, whether it's winter or more likely the summer tourism economy, et cetera. I mean, this is important to have access to workers. I was just actually out in Lebanon at Patch Orchards, and they had three three Jamaicans that had been working there for 20 years on a seasonal visa to do some of the picking of, corn and apples, etc. But yet every year that job has to be posted for an American to potentially come and take, and no American takes it, and then they're allowed to come back in. They've done it legally, but it's a lot of paperwork and a lot of heartache. We should streamline and make legal immigration more appropriate. Now, to your question about those individuals who came here as young individuals, maybe children, and their parents maybe were the ones who, came over with this, it came over illegally, and they've been raised here. That presents a really tough problem, where this is where, at least philosophically, I can say to you, Bill, that I believe we have to come up with a mechanism to balance compassion of these individuals who have come here and mean well, and it wasn't their own doing, and this is their life, and this is their society, and if they're contributing, then we should figure out a way to balance that compassion with the rule of law. And I don't know if that's a penalty, and then you get behind the line, so you get a path towards citizenship, but it's a delayed path. It's one that sort of maybe costs extra money. There's a penalty, something. It cannot be that they get a free pass to the front of the line. My parents came here legally. My dad, came in on an education visa, got a green card, was an auto mechanic, eventually got married to my mother. She came in on a green card. The two of them continue to believe that some of the proudest days of their lives was when they handed in their green cards and took their oath to the United States Constitution and became naturalized Americans. They also are uncomfortable with people cutting the line. They're probably more uncomfortable than a lot of people are. I think immigrants who came in that followed the rules, that played by the way they were supposed to, that didn't take handouts, that waited their turn, that did the studying for the citizenship exams, etc. They're kind of annoyed by those who are allowed a free pass. And I think to respect everyone who does it right, we have to get the incentives right.
Okay. So the other, I guess related to that, you talked about not having enough skilled workers in the right areas. And you also talked about being able to grow the economy. And you've called for innovation and job creation.
Yep.
Right now we have in many areas more jobs than people willing to take them. So how do you address that dynamic and make the jobs that need doing more attractive to workers?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a great example, because I'm involved in the trucking sector right now. I am sitting on the board of one of America's largest trucking companies. I have my own, in fact, it's actually an interesting tidbit that some of those who watch this replay may appreciate. When I was elected onto the board of Werner Enterprises, other directors, some chose to spend their director education budgets on going to get, audit certified or going to the, governance institutes or what have you. And that's fine. I'm not going to belittle that. That's all useful. I chose to go get my CDL license. I went to Roadmaster truck driving school and actually learned how to drive a big rig. That's how I spent my resources for education, and I spent my time on that purpose. Why? Because I think that helps me understand the front lines of an organization that I'm supposed to represent drivers. I need to understand their perspective by actually doing what they do. By the way, that's the same approach I would take being a U.S. Senator, right? Spend time with granite staters to understand who I'm representing and what their concerns are, and take them to in this case, the boardroom, but in the other case, the U.S. Senate. But here's some tidbits that could prove interesting and could help us move this conversation forward. 80,000 fewer truck drivers in America today, according to the American Trucking Association, than are needed. There's a shortage of 80,000 truck drivers. So you're right, we have a shortage here. An average truck driver, upon completion of their CDL training and earning a CDL, will likely have a short training period, 2-3 months, after which they will earn at the rate of $72,000 a year coming out of the gate. And over time, with experience, Walmart, for instance, last year was offering $110,000 a year for truck drivers that have experience and are willing to be over the road. These are professions that are providing a new form of economic security for those that pursue these professions than have historically been thought possible. I think that's a story that needs to get out there, because I think markets work, economics work. And I believe, Bill, that what would happen is as more and more people learn that this is a possibility. Look, no student debt. I guess now maybe if you don't care, you don't think you have to pay it back, you could maybe not have this analysis, but historically, no student debt. Maybe you take out a little bit to go to truck driving school, and then the trucking company that hires you pays it off over a certain period of time, and you earn a reasonable living. That's not bad. And by the way, because of the shift with e-commerce and last mile, staying at home most nights is actually becoming more and more possible for truck drivers. This is an example where the dignity, the social cultural context that has historically put manual and blue collar work down needs to shift. There's a lot of dignity in that work, and that we shouldn't belittle folks who are actually delivering the stuff that others are using, right? So I think there needs to be a different framing of it, an acknowledgement that there's some real value, there's some real purpose, and yes, there's a mismatch of where labor is and where it needs to be, and that's always the case in an economy that's doing well. There's frictional adjustments that need to take time to fix, but I think it'll fix itself, because I think at the end of the day, a profession that offers a $75,000 to $120,000 a year job in the first few years after working is going to be seen as attractive, and it should draw people of all walks of life,
So that's a great commercial for trucking. But what in the United States Senate needs to be done to help that matching, or
Yep.
Or, you said the economy is doing well. Obviously,
Yep.
You see inflation as an issue there still, but what is the Senate going to do? Because that's what you're running for.
Sure, that's right. No, so let's use an example. You want to stick with trucking. I mean, trucking has a whole host of issues that can be addressed, and whether it's I mean, the taxes that result in different fuel rates that flow through into less demand for trucking, that then results in less compensation for certain driving routes and stuff like that. There's all sorts of issues we can get into that are complicated, that have multi-layers, of where the Senate has a role that could impact the trucking industry, and the trucking industry could, by impacting the industry, you will affect the outlook for those that are going into that industry and their potential compensation and the labor markets around that. So there's a couple of links there, but it is absolutely something that a senator should be thinking about in that regard. However, I think your question is broader, which is economically, what can we do to de-bottleneck some of the labor bottlenecks that exist, and what can a U.S. senator do about that? Well, again, I'd come back to, if it's immigration, sort of liberalizing some of the visa restrictions in certain areas that we have strong skill bottlenecks, right? So again, semiconductor PhD know-how in terms of producing a semiconductor plant and getting it running and operating it, et cetera. That's a unique know-how for which we lack the appropriate number of individuals. And I don't know whether that means thousands or whether that means hundreds, but there's some shortage there, and we can address that through immigration policy. I also think, whether it's the infrastructure spending, we have physical bottlenecks that exist, whether it's certain ports don't have the right capacity, whether rails don't have the right capacity, whether we have inappropriate regulation that's sort of strangleholding. I mean, we only being able to have certain hours of the day operational for certain ports and stuff. Like, these are things where the federal government has gotten involved to try to help break through bottlenecks. So I do think there's some bottlenecks, and the government can be involved in helping break those. That could alleviate inflation. But in labor markets specifically, look, at the end of the day, I think markets work. Compensation should adjust. Compensation is a signaling mechanism for the price of labor. Labor will move to where it's valued most. That should happen, and I think it's starting to. It never happens instantaneously, but it should happen. Where it doesn't happen and there are market breakdowns, well, that's an opportunity for the government to assist. And, it's not happening, for instance, in very highly skilled areas like semiconductor manufacturing know-how. But those, I don't know how large that is. And I'll admit my ignorance there.
Okay. So we've covered a fairly broad swath of topics, or you have at least, with minimal prodding. Is there anything else that our readers or our viewers on our website ought to know about your candidacy?
Well, I think it's interesting. One of the things that really does disturb me, and I think it's an increasing part of what I find resonating on the campaign trail here, and it might be something that your readers find interesting, is the identity politics that has been really bubbling up in a big way is, I think, gone too far, and it's causing problems. And, how we address this as a government at the federal level and others is, it's going to be a complicated and a tough issue to what to do about it. But let me give you some examples. Harvard, I think where it begins at education, actually. One of my ideas is educate, don't indoctrinate. And I think there's a lot of ways we can describe that, but the belief system that separates individuals rather than unifies them is a problem. So Harvard this year had 6 identity graduations. 6 of them. There was a Black graduation. There was a lavender graduation. There was a Latinx graduation. There was even a graduation, I think this one's particularly offensive because this is the bucket I would have been in, a first generation and low income graduation. There was an Asian American and Pacific Islander graduation. I can't even keep them all straight. This is literally dividing. Why not celebrate the commonality? I mean, literally the graduation garb is intended to get rid of differences. Everyone wears black, everyone wears a tassel, right? It's sort of, and yet we've gone to the other extreme. This identity politics is ripping this country apart. It's pitting neighbor against neighbor. And I think it's gone too far. We've given up diversity of perspective in return for other forms of diversity. Last personal story. So I declared in April of this year that I would be running for the US Senate as a Republican. That's not a particular popular party, let's say, in what I can now sometimes affectionately and humorously call the People's Republic of Cambridge. And so down in Cambridge, being a Republican, A, is not common, but B, is not particularly liked. And so despite having taught for 5 years there and 8 years prior at Yale with decent teaching reviews and great performance in any objective measure, I was not reappointed this past year. I was not reappointed. The only reason I can imagine I was not reappointed is that, well, maybe I was running for office, and that may be a valid reason. I'm on an annual appointment. However, I was also in the midst of a professor of practice application for a position that I had been working with the dean on, and I had filled out an application and provided all the materials. And so I said, oh, that's fine. Let's not worry about my annual reappointment. We'll focus on the bigger prize. I'm running for office anyway. However, in July, I was informed that my application there, which had been complete for 9 months, was not considered and was not complete. And again, the only rationale I can think of is that I declared my candidacy as a Republican. In fact, one senior faculty member, I was walking by in the halls of Cambridge, halls of Harvard, asked me, is it true you're running? And I said, yeah, I am running for the USA. He said, that's so exciting. I said, but tell me it's not true you're running as a Republican. And I said, it is true. And he said, well, that's disappointing. And he walked away. Sort of a typical interaction that I sensed. And so this reminds me of sort of, honestly, like 1984. This is like, what do you call it? That sort of thought speaker. I forget what the phrase was that they used that Orwell used. But it's concerning. It's really concerning. And this comes out of this ideology, I mean, literally the ideals of the American Revolution, free speech, sort of all of those ideals are giving way to, and I'm going to use this term intentionally because we talk so much about China, a cultural revolution that is creating a whole new set of problems. We've gone from aspiring to have people judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin, to dividing graduates based on the color of their skin. This has gone too far. I really think identity politics is causing a lot of anxiety here, and it's ripping this country apart. I've personally felt it with my own experience. The phrase we're using is I was canceled by Harvard, because you can't say I was fired. I wasn't really fired. I was on an annual appointment. I was not rehired. Okay, well, that's a different. But canceled seems to capture the essence of what transpired. So that's the only other tidbit I'd say. I think that, the whole gender dynamic issue, inappropriate at young ages of schooling. I think, parents deserve to have transparency and understand what's going on in their schools. So I think that's part of this identity politics that comes into play, where, there's just perhaps a little too much on shared identity dynamics rather than shared interest dynamics, which I think would be more appropriate. So that's the last tidbit. That's the last tidbit I'd add, that I think is, it's a gigantic issue, and I get it, but it's, not one that can be easily packaged into a soundbite, but it's what I think. I want to focus on what unifies this country, not what divides it. I mean, my dad, he doesn't need hyphens to describe who he is. He doesn't say I'm an Indian American or a Desi American Indian or what, or, I'm an American. He's an American. We have a lot in common. Let's focus on what we have in common, not what separates us.